If the finished product is heavier, bulkier, or more fragile than the raw materials, then the cost of transporting that product is going to be greater than the cost of transporting the raw materials. And in those cases, transportation costs will be minimized by locating the plant closer to the market. And we call those particular industries market-oriented industries. Now, there are several extensions of this. In this particular slide, we show a resource-oriented firm for whom the total cost of transportation are lower at the resource site than they are at the market. Weber's diagrams for a market-oriented firm would look like this, where the total cost of transportation are lower at the market than they are at the resource site. To account for different types of transportation, Weber introduced the idea of monetary weight, which is a combination of the cost of transportation and the weight of that transportation. I won't go into too much detail about that. I think that the major takeaway from this is that when transportation costs are a major cost, that firms may decide to locate in particular cities based upon their proximity to where they're going to sell the good, or upon their proximity to where they're going to get their raw materials from. That this can be an important part in the decision making of firms, and therefore an important consideration in the type of cities that grow up in different places. Now, is this the sole determining factor in terms of where firms are located? No. And Weber actually had a very complicated concept that dealt with this. He called it isotopanes, which was the equivalent of isoquants or other things that those of you who had microeconomics may be familiar with. But the idea that transportation costs can be offset by the cost of other things that are some of the components of production. We'll talk about some of that, I think, next class as we get to some of the ways in which decreases in transportation costs have affected cities. Now, Weber also talked about what happens when there is more than one resource site. So he did complicate things a bit. And his conclusion was, well, it depends upon what the cost would be of the two types of procurement cost, and what the cost would be of the distribution cost, and that once you weighted all of those, you would find an ideal location for a transportation cost-oriented firm that would lie somewhere within a triangle formed by the resource sites and the market. An example of this of resources coming from several different places is steel production, where we have taconite from Duluth and coal from West Virginia and limestone from Michigan. And this is very common in production, that we do draw our raw materials from different places. So this is kind of a very speedy introduction to one of the ideas of location of firms. Now we want to talk about a few other location dynamics.
So we've seen why it is that metropolitan areas are such an attractive place for business firms to locate. We've seen why it is that metropolitan areas are such an attractive place for people to locate. But now let's see if we can peel another layer of the onion back and say, okay, we understand why it is that there is this attraction to the metropolitan area, but what happens inside the metropolitan area? What is the shape of the metropolitan area, and how does that change over time? And so if we want to know, okay, if the metropolitan area is comprised of a central city and a suburb, how are business firms locating themselves between the central city and the suburb? How are people locating themselves across the map of the metropolitan area? And so, in the next slide, take a look at what happened over time. In the early part of the 20th century, about 2/3 of the people who lived in metropolitan areas lived inside the central city. By the time we get to the end of the 20th century, only 1/3 still live inside the central city. That is a very dramatic change over just a few decades. And so one of the questions we can ask is, what's going on here? Why was it that in the earlier part of the 20th century, metropolitan areas developed in such a concentrated way with things centralized in the central city? What then happens that causes things to flow in the other direction and causes such decentralization? Although this is talking about the percentage of population that lives in the central city, and we see that it goes from 2/3 to 1/3, we can tell a similar story about jobs. In most metropolitan areas, the majority of jobs are not in the central city. They're in the suburbs. They have also decentralized. So, why? Well, we can go back to our story of market forces and government policy. In terms of market forces, we can look at some of the sorts of transportation, the transportation technology that was in place earlier in the 20th century and later in the 20th century, or even going back to the late 19th century. If you were to take a course in American economic history and you were to look at the biggest change in the late 19th century, that focus would be on the railroads, because the advent of the railroads, the ability to ship things long distances, really fundamentally shaped the economy of the United States in the period from the late 19th and early 20th century. But railroads have depots, and depots aren't located just anywhere. Railroad depots are located in the downtowns of central cities. And so as long as the method of transportation was primarily by rail, it meant that things were being shipped from the downtown of one central city to the downtown of another central city. And that meant that factories located near the depots, warehouses located near the depots, and people who wanted jobs in factories and warehouses needed to locate near where those jobs were. So earlier in the late 19th and early 20th century, you have the impact of the railroad and the fact that the depots were so centralized inside the major cities. What then begins to happen in the early 20th century is that you get some inventions for commuters that allow people to move a little bit farther away from their jobs. And so you get the early subways. I think you can still go to the Boylston Street station on the Green Line and see a little history of the first subway station in Boston, the first subway line in Boston, which went from Boylston Street to Park Street, and makes you step back and say, why did they bother? But it's an indication of the amount of traffic that was going on there, that it actually was worth figuring out a faster way to get people from Boylston Street to Park Street. So you've got the subways, you've got the elevated trains, you've got the streetcars, you've got the trolleys. Every city has a different name for them. But what they did was they allowed people to move out along those lines as long as they were within walking distance of those lines. The places in between the lines were still pretty inaccessible, but it allowed some people to move farther out. And it really is what was going on in some of the transit-oriented suburbs of the 19th century, places like, in this area, places like Brookline and Newton. But at the same time that it allows for people to move out, this invention still reinforces the central city as the place for business. Because, yes, people can spread out along these subway lines, and certainly if you look at the map of the Boston subways, it's like the spokes of a wheel. But still, the only place where you can gather a labor force is at the hub of the wheel. And so these inventions that allow people to decentralize still reinforce the central city as a place to do business, as a place to locate your factory, your warehouse, your office. And another invention of the late 19th century eases the pain of this. This land is very expensive. And because the land is very expensive, you want to use it more intensively. Just like when gasoline prices go up, you don't want a gas guzzler anymore, you want a car that's fuel efficient. Well, in this case, it was an invention that made things land efficient. And what I'm talking about is the invention of the skyscraper. It means that you can stack floor upon floor upon floor and get lots more square feet of usable space than if you could only build 6 or 7 or 8 stories into the sky. And so those kinds of inventions tended to reinforce the central city as a place to do business, even as it allowed some residential decentralization. But of course, all of that begins to change with the invention of the automobile. And certainly we've heard lots about how it allowed all different it allowed more mobility for people. It apparently changed courtship patterns in lots of ways. So we have all of these different impacts of the automobile that allow people more flexibility in where they're going to live. But we focus so much on the automobile that we forget the other thing that came along with that transportation revolution, which is the truck. And if you think about the location of warehouses, I mentioned earlier that in the 19th century, the warehouse had to be right next to the railroad depot. But in the 20th century, where does the warehouse need to be? Not necessarily near the warehouse depot, to the extent that we now transport goods by truck. What you want is a place that's along a major highway, and if one highway is good, 2 major highways is even better. And so if you look at, say, the intersection of the Mass Pike with Route 495, I think there's even a sign there. It used to be there, I think it's still there, and the sign says, Gateway to New England. And what that translates as is, this is the place to put your warehouse. And it's a whole different story of the calculus of where you locate a warehouse, where you locate a factory. Now, of course, again, at the same time that these are market forces that change the kinds of decisions that people make and the kinds of decisions that business firms make, again, I think Barry and Paul will come back to the public policy part of the story, in which the federal government essentially subsidized people for saying, I want to have a new home in the suburbs. The federal government will help me out with my mortgage. The Federal Housing Authority will guarantee my mortgage. The federal income tax will give me a tax break on my mortgage. The Highway Act that was passed in the 1950s, which was ostensibly about national defense, will allow me easy access. So I'm going to be rewarded in lots of very substantial ways if I choose the suburbs. If I choose to stay inside the central city, well, then I'm on my own. And as economists, we know that people respond to incentives. Give people incentives to move to the suburbs, they'll move to the suburbs. And so it's not simply a matter of the market forces, but really the interaction of the market forces and the public policy. So what has that meant for central cities? Well, it's meant different things for different central cities. Okay. There's going to be a series of 3 graphs here. So San Francisco actually has more people living within it in 2000 than at any time in the 20th century. So San Francisco reaches its a peak right after World War II. It starts declining, but it's now back up there again. San Francisco is a very attractive place to live, very vibrant place to live, and so San Francisco continues to be an attractive place for people to live. And cities in general tend to be very attractive to, or at least I should say, cities that are attractive tend to be attractive to younger people. And so it's the sort of post-college crowd. In those cities that have gained or held population, it's been essentially the post-college young adults without family, who find interesting things to do in the cities. It's been the baby boom generation that's now experiencing an empty nest, and some of the wealthier and more educated of that population is deciding the suburbs don't have the same kind of allure. And as we mentioned previously, in many cities, what's allowing population to stabilize or grow is the stream of immigration post-1965 after the laws have changed. So that's worked well for San Francisco. Hasn't worked so well for Detroit. Detroit has lost, since 1950, Detroit has lost about half of its population. A very different story. In part, Detroit is not a place that attracts new immigrants. It's not a place that's very interesting for young people. Older people who are a little bit more footloose might decide that not only are they going to leave their suburban home in Detroit, but they're going to leave that metropolitan area altogether. So I think what I'm trying to illustrate here is that when we tell the story of metropolitan areas, it's not just one story. It's lots of different stories and lots of different fates. And I think in the coming weeks you'll learn more about why it is that these places have such different fates. I think there's one more slide here, which is Atlanta, which is, as a newer city, it's reached its peak much later, but it is also decentralizing. And so you can see that kind of decentralization going on there. So, Russell will be back next week, but I won't, and so I'd like to give you a little bit of a coming attraction of the kinds of things that you're going to be getting into next week. And really what you're going to be getting into is the whole question of how does land get its value? Why is it that some pieces of property are so valuable, other pieces of property are not, other pieces of property are almost worthless? And part of what I want to argue is that my guess is that many of you are already, maybe not experts in the field, but you know something about it. Does this look familiar? How many of you wasted countless hours in your youth playing this game? Well, now you can go back and tell your mother that it wasn't all wasted. Because in fact, a lot of the things that we know about land values, and of course it's a lot more complicated than the story that is told by this board, but a lot of the things that we know about land values, we actually know from the experience of playing Monopoly. So what did you learn when you played Monopoly? What are some of the things that you know happens when you play Monopoly? A little louder?
Build on it.
Build on it. Okay, so if you land on a property, you buy it, and